Well, good evening. My name is Fran Ferguson. I'm the director of the Salem Museum. Delighted to have all of you with us tonight, and especially delighted to have Cameron Patterson, who is the executive director of the Moton Museum. He is a terrific speaker. I've heard him before, and we really are in for a treat this evening. Cameron Patterson is the executive director of the Robert Russell Moton Museum. He's going to tell you more about the museum as well as the story behind it. Before joining the Moton in 2017, Patterson worked in student affairs at Longwood University. He has served as a member of the Virginia African American Advisory Board and the State Board of Directors for the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, and as vice chairman for the Farmville Area Chamber of Commerce, vice chairman for the Farmville Planning Commission, and a member of the Prince Edward Christmas Mother Board. Also a member of the board of the Virginia Association of Museums. He's a Lynchburg, Virginia graduate, a native, graduated from Longwood University with a Bachelor of Science in History and a Master's in Counselor Education. Lots of things that prepared him for this great job that he's doing at the Moton. So Cameron, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fran. I'm so excited to be with you all this evening. I would have normally given the presentation from the museum, had planned to set myself up in the auditorium, but as we know, the weather is coming and I wanted to make sure I was home safe and sound. But I'm grateful that technology allows us the opportunity to stay connected and engage with one another. Again, my name is Cameron Patterson. I have the great fortune of serving as executive director for the Robert Russell Moton Museum. The Moton Museum is Virginia's only civil rights museum and a National Historic Landmark. And it's a pretty big year for life at the museum. This year, we celebrate 20 years of being open to the public. And we also commemorate the 70th anniversary of the student walkout that Barbara Rose Johns led. And so we're excited for all of the opportunities that we will get to highlight both of those occasions. And I look forward to sharing a bit more on that at the end of this presentation. But, you know, a bit about our mission. Our mission has really been unchanged since our founding. And, you know, we're really proud of the work that it allows us to do. Our mission is to preserve and interpret the history of Prince Edward County as it relates to civil rights and education, and the leading role that our local county citizens played in helping our country move from segregation to integration. We also give considerable attention to advancing dialogues that helps to ensure a constitutional democracy. And I think that particularly has been very important part of the work that we do. It's, you know, when you think about this story that I'll share about tonight, you really recognize that it is a story of young folks primarily that are using the tools of a constitutional democracy to bring about change. And it's very important that our work highlights that. Additionally, we are focused on collecting materials that help us to tell this history. Our work through the permanent exhibit, Moton School Story, Children of Courage, really recognizes this idea of citizenship, empowerment, and democracy. And those are really the guiding principles at the heart of this permanent exhibit. And the Moton story really teaches us that the rights of citizens must be affirmed regardless of color, party, class, religion, orientation, economic circumstance. And again, this is a story of ordinary citizens who have come together in a pretty courageous way to help move our country forward. And while we know this idea of separate but equal is something that we're still continuing to strive towards, I certainly believe that the children of Prince Edward County, those in our community that labored for civil rights and education, have helped us to move closer to that ideal. This is a story that relates to audiences of all ages. And really, a quote that comes to mind for me as we share about this is a quote from James Baldwin that says that the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and that it's present in all that we do. And so, as we share tonight, I think we're all kind of coming together, excited about recent events that have given renewed energy and spirit to our work at Moton, and really have encouraged countless individuals who might not have known about Prince Edward County's story to come to know it. And so we're really excited about that. Based on those recent events, it is important to note that the Commission on Statues in the U.S. Capitol voted to recommend that Barbara Rose Johns become the second representative from the Commonwealth of Virginia in the National Statuary Hall Collection, replacing Robert E. Lee. This was a powerful decision by commission members, and one that I believe represents the values that the Commonwealth of Virginia now seeks to proclaim. These are values of inclusion, equality, justice for all, and ensuring that the decisions that we make are done through the lens of equity. The commission had a fantastic final five. And many of those individuals who were considered really showed that for states like Virginia, we recognize that while our past is linked to issues such as segregation and the civil rights movement, that we must continue to own that history and learn from it so that we can better ensure the representation of all students. For it is these stories that allow us to tackle issues of racism, intolerance, and prejudice. And it is stories like that of Barbara Rose Johns, the student strikers of Robert Russell Moton High School, the students locked out of public schools in Prince Edward County, Virginia, that help us connect this historical content to our own lives. So hopefully we can be better participants in issues impacting our communities. Tonight, as we highlight Barbara Rose Johns' statue being on the verge of inclusion in the U.S. Capitol, I want to give you a look at the story behind that portrait, behind that statue, as we share more broadly the impact she was able to make and how it fits more broadly into the movement within Prince Edward County. Tonight, I share this through the lens of two generations of students, the walkout and the lockout generations. The walkout generation features that story of Barbara Johns and her classmates who walked out of school on April 23rd, 1951, 70 years ago, and set into motion a series of events that culminated in the Brown decision, of which Prince Edward County had a majority of the plaintiffs. The lockout generation features those who were shut out of school from 1959 to 1964. And it is the sacrifices of both of those generations that help redefine equality for all in our public education system. Their commitment to the principles and their resilience ensured that our educational system remains a training ground for an enlightened citizenry. We share that Moton in Prince Edward County, Virginia, is the birthplace of the student-led civil rights movement, and we know that it started the modern civil rights movement. Those courageous acts that these students undertake as they went on strike happened 4 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, 9 years before the first Greensboro sit-ins, and we recently commemorated the sacrifice of the Greensboro Four, and before the Selma to Montgomery voting rights marches. Now, I want to spend a few moments in the lead up to 1951. We all know 1951 really as that beginning event for what we share as a part of the Moton story. But I think it's important for you to recognize and understand that the significance of Farmville and Prince Edward County to American history is certainly not limited to the 20th century. The final days of the Civil War drew to a close in and around Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County was home to the community of Israel Hill, a group of emancipated people who before the Civil War became successful farmers, merchants, and artisans. The period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, produced what Christopher Bonista in his book Social Order. There were 27 Blacks elected among the 180 new members of the Virginia General Assembly in 1870. Among those elected in that period was a gentleman from Prince Edward County by the name of Tazewell Branch, who served 2 terms in the House of Delegates, and who was also father to Mary E. Branch, a noted educator, college president, and one of the founders of the United Negro College Fund. Farmville was also where in the 1890s, W.E.B. Du Bois visited to us of migrants to Philadelphia for his research that he provided to the United States Department of Labor. Prince Edward County is situated in the Black Belt, a stretch of land that extends from the Chesapeake Bay through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas. The Black Belt counties had high populations of Black residents, and sometimes those Black residents outpaced the white populace. Farmville had a population of nearly 4,500 in the late 1950s, and today that population is almost 8,500. Longwood University, a residential campus founded in 1839, has historically accounted for half of that population. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the counties would rely on its agricultural output, and that agriculture would play a significant role as we move towards the court case Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward. Understanding as well, the student walkout also requires you to have an understanding of what was happening educationally during this time period in Prince Edward County. The Robert Russell Moton High School was built in 1939, and these are photos of that high school property. This was the first standalone all-Black high school that was built in Prince Edward County, and only the second brick building for the county as well. The school was built with funding from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Federal Public Works Administration, which provided 45% of the financing for that new school. And at the time, this was a significant achievement to have that standalone school. And it was truly the result of advocacy from members of the community that were wanting to ensure that there were resources for Black students in Prince Edward County. Now, the right leadership in Prince Edward County and Farmville particularly always articulated that they had done right by way of Black citizens. J. Barry Wall, the editor of the Farmville Herald, would often editorialize that Black citizens were not contributing to the tax base at the rate of white citizens, and that was the reason for their fiscal plan not being up to par. Superintendent T.J. McElwain, who was named superintendent of both Prince Edward County and Cumberland County schools in 1918 and remained in Prince Edward County until after public schools reopened in 1964, would argue and hang his hat on the fact that the county had increased the number of 1- and 2-room schools across the county and that grades for Black students had been extended. But for all of the accomplishments, it is important to note that many of those accomplishments came because of the advocacy of groups such as the Council for Colored Women, because of the work of the Parent-Teacher Association. When the decision was made to extend those grades for Black students in Prince Edward County, it was the community through that Council for Colored Women that came together to support the financial costs related to that. For every victory won, it was the result of a hard-fought effort. Now, I think it's also important that as we lead towards 1951, that we also understand the importance of local advocacy. Local advocacy didn't begin with the student strike. There had been individuals laboring within the community to bring attention to the lack of unequal facilities, unequal resources for our Black students in Prince Edward County. And I want to just, note a couple of individuals, 2 of which are on the screen before you. Local advocacy had always been that hallmark. I think the neat thing is that at every turn, whether it's prior to the student walkout, during the student walkout, as public schools remain closed in Prince Edward County, after public schools reopen, and even as the Moton Museum site transitions to a museum, that advocacy on behalf of the community had always been that hallmark. 2 individuals before you, the first was Martha E. Forster, who led the Council for Colored Women, which would later be renamed in her honor following her death in 1951. They led those fundraising efforts to build the first standalone all-Black high school. They led those fundraising efforts as they sought to extend grades for Black students. They often would make sure that our Black students had the resources that the county would not provide for them. That work was important. That work would certainly continue throughout Prince Edward County's history. Additionally, before you, we have the Reverend L. Francis Griffin. He and individuals such as Mr. John Lancaster led the Parent-Teacher Association, and they worked tirelessly to bring attention to the need for better educational facilities. The students of Moton High School, they saw this work that their parents and community leaders were putting forth. But these students began to recognize, particularly Barbara Rose Johns, that if their parents, if community leaders weren't able to make progress, then maybe it was time for the students to step forward. As we transition next, continuing to that lead up to the 1951 student walkout, I love this quote. I always love suggesting reading material as it relates to Prince Edward County. There's a lot of great material, beginning with Bob Smith, R.C. Smith. They closed their schools. We unfortunately lost him earlier this year as he passed away, but he really wrote that first detailed history of what had happened here in Prince Edward County, the foundation if you are seeking to come to understand this story. But additionally, Richard Kluger, author of the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Simple Justice, remarked that in the middle of the 20th century in a remote county, that time had often left to dawdle amid a picture book loveliness of Virginia's countryside, a leader arose. That leader, of course, was 16-year-old Barbara Rose Johns, a leader of courage who stepped forward in this moment. As we look closely at Barbara Rose Johns, there are a few things that stand out to me about who she was. I think first, the connection that she had to her family, her parents, her grandparents, her siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, was certainly a foundational part of who she was, particularly the experiences that she shared growing up in Darlington Heights, Virginia, a community within Prince Edward County. And secondly, I look at that transformational experience that she had at Robert Russell Moton High School. The leadership that she was able to display as a student at Robert Russell Moton High School, I believe really helps to give her the foundation and the tools needed to step forward in this moment. Again, those ties to Prince Edward County run deep. Those ties to her community in Darlington Heights, her church, Triumph Baptist. She was born in New York to her parents, Violet and Robert Johns, moved to Prince Edward County during the Second World War to live on the farm. We often know of the close relationship that she had with her grandmother. And we often know that that relationship was foundational for her as well. As she began that matriculation into Robert Russell Moton High School, she became actively involved in various student activities. And I think we recognize that in the life of a student, those activities that you're involved with outside of your traditional classroom experiences really have the opportunity and the ability to set that foundation for you. As a result of being involved, she and her classmates were really surrounded by encouraging and nurturing teachers, parents, community members. That experience at Moton, we talk about it as part of the exhibit experience at the museum. It's very important. I think it's, part of the reason that these students, as they were undertaking this strike, their goal wasn't to integrate initially. They just wanted access to the resources that they knew they deserved. But Barbara participated in the Drama Guild, the New Housemakers of America, a member of the high school chorus, elected to student council. And I think often you will hear students speak of those experiences as opportunities for them to travel, to see localities and communities outside of Prince Edward County. And understanding and having those experiences to travel outside of your home county really gives you the opportunity, I think, to put things in perspective. As she made her travels across Virginia, she saw schools in Newport News. She saw schools in Lawrenceville. She saw schools in King George. And these were other all-Black schools. And she saw that those schools were far better than what students had access to here in Farmville at Robert Russell Moton High. And at a point, there comes a point where you really begin to recognize, man, our school and the facilities that they are providing us really doesn't speak well to our county. And, it really doesn't speak well to the experience that we are receiving as a result. Again, always this belief, this understanding that if they had access to the same equal resources, that their experience would be that much greater. again, you know, so, you know, there's the family, there's the ability to travel the Commonwealth as a result of the involvement that she had. And additionally, I think she started to see some of the decisions that the county would make that really showed her and others that the county was not seriously committed to doing right by way of this new school. One instance of that was the tar paper shacks. The tar paper shack buildings that were placed on the museum property. These were 3 tar paper shack structures. And I want you to think of the way in which a school district might invest in modular classrooms to handle overcrowded conditions. These tar paper shacks were poorly built structures made out of tar paper, with the potbelly stove being at the heart of that classroom. In the museum, we allow visitors to step into life inside of the tar paper shack, showing them the conditions that the students face. Barbara was certainly troubled by these conditions. And, you know, she felt, and, you know, many members of the community felt that those tar paper shack structures were really a slap in the face towards the promises that the school board had been making. Some of the additional inequalities that Barbara speaks to as defining for her. If you were a student, one of the first inequalities that you honestly might notice were inequalities as it related to school buses. You would often see the more brand new school buses carrying students to the various white schools in the county. And then you would notice, as a Black student in Prince Edward, that you had access to a school bus that was not in the best of shape. Really a school bus that really should have been retired as a result of its condition. For example, Barbara mentions an incident where she and her siblings were headed to the bus stop to make their way to Moton one morning. She forgets her lunch. She goes back to get her lunch. By the time she returns to the bus stop, her siblings had gotten on and made their way to school. And so she was left contemplating how she would get to school. And she sees that more brand new school bus half empty, taking students to the all-white Farmville High School, knowing that that bus would have to ride right by Moton. That frustrated her. It was, again, this understanding, this recognition that they deserved better. Black students in Prince Edward County, including Barbara, recognized the work, again, that adults were doing on their behalf, but also saw that progress was still needed to advance equality. The students of Robert Russell Moton High School, through the walkout, had brought forward many concerns related to their inadequate school building and the lack of resources that educators had to deliver a quality classroom experience. Again, when you compare Moton High School to Farmville High School in regards to the facilities, it is glaring. The photo evidence through the National Archives that were used in the Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward case, which would later become one of the 5 that would make up Brown v. Board, truly paints the picture of separate but not equal. When you look at the facility comparisons, you recognize and begin to see that the outer appearance of the school buildings were drastically different. Farmville High School had a fixed seat auditorium, had a fixed a cafeteria, a gymnasium, a nurse's station, access to ample science laboratories, a home ec room, none of which the students at Robert R. Moton had access to. And again, there was quickly the recognition that collective action was needed to address these concerns. And so as early as 1950, Barbara would convene the first meeting to begin to share her thoughts related to the conditions at Robert R. Moton High. She quickly recognized the importance of collective action in reaching out to leaders within the student body that she knew, that she trusted, that she felt could help her bring these plans together. That group of leaders that would have these initial conversations would be the nucleus of that student strike committee. And those meetings would continue through the spring semester until we marched towards that April 23rd date. Those meetings were held on the concrete bleachers of the football field at Robert R. Moton High. One of her classmates, John Stokes, remembers that first meeting in which Barbara would recount the school conditions, speak to the fact that their parents were not making progress with the school board, and begin to articulate the words that most famously have become associated with her, this idea of a little child shall lead. Those meetings continued as the planning efforts grew. More individuals brought into that planning process to put together the event that would happen on April 23rd. And there was a recognition by Barbara, there was a recognition by that planning team about the secrecy in which they had to operate. Barbara certainly wanted to protect the teachers of Robert R. Moton, Principal M. Boyd Jones. She wanted to protect her parents because they knew that there could potentially be retaliation for the actions that they would undertake. So what I love as well about what Barbara was able to do alongside her classmates is the creativity as they pulled off that student walkout on April 23rd. You know, the day starts out with one of the individuals on the student planning team, Mr. John Watson, phoning to the school with a disguised voice. John was a radio man. That was his involvement as a high school student, would continue to be what he did professionally, career-wise. So he disguises that voice to let Principal Jones know that some of his students are downtown causing a disturbance. And because Principal Jones, being the protective figure that he was, he knew that he had to get down there to check things out because he knew the consequences that could potentially come from those actions. After that, Barbara and the strike committee distribute notes to the teachers requesting that they bring their students to the auditorium. They file in from classrooms and from outside where the students attended classes in those tar paper shack structures. And when everyone filed into that auditorium, they were met by a 16-year-old junior, Barbara Rose Johns, and members of that student strike committee. And after the many months of planning that were undertaken to organize the assembly, they were ready to make the case to the student body. Barbara stood behind the podium on the stage and made the case about the inadequate conditions that they faced. And in recounting the process behind that decision, Barbara would say, the plan I felt was divinely inspired because I hadn't been able to think of anything until then. The plan was to assemble together the student council members. From this, we would formulate plans to go on strike. We would make signs. I would give a speech stating our dissatisfaction. We would march out of school, and people would hear us and see us and understand our difficulty and would sympathize with our plight and would grant us that new school building, and our teachers would be proud and students would learn more and it would be grand. Those were her hopes for the plans that came together. Now, as I scroll through the photos that I have here in the presentation, it really gives you an understanding of the conditions that students attended school in at Robert R. Moton. And further, you will see some of the comparisons with the all-white Farmville High School. These were part of the photo evidence used in the Davis case, which would eventually become part of Brown v. Board. So here you see the Robert Russell Moton High School auditorium. So just imagine physically 450 students attending school in this space. It certainly speaks to the overcrowded conditions that they faced. Recognize that this school was built for 180 students. And a decade later, there were 450 students attending school here. So this gives you a better sense of how crammed that auditorium space could become. I know right now, present day, the fire marshal would not be pleased with that many folks in that space. Again, you see the photo here of that tar paper shack that I referenced. One of 3 structures built on the property. Again, think modular classrooms that schools use today, but these tar paper shack structures were certainly in far worse condition. Again, this photo gives you a glimpse of the inside of that tar paper shack structure, the potbelly stove being at the heart of that classroom experience. I think one of the things that inequalities did is it replaced additional responsibilities on students. We have a museum volunteer that recounts it being his responsibility to come to the school building to ensure that that fire got started each morning so that it could be ready for students to arrive. Again, those were those extra responsibilities that students faced. I have another museum volunteer that recounted that it was his responsibility at 16 years of age to serve as a school bus driver. Just imagine the pressure that comes from having to drive a bus of your peers at that age. Again, inequalities, those extra responsibilities that students had to take on. Again, that's another photo inside that tar paper shack classroom. Here you see that comparison, Robert R. Moton High School and Farmville High School. Only a year separates when both of these buildings opened, but you see that Farmville was built in a quiet, high at the time was in a more rural area. The town hadn't really yet expanded that far out. Present day Moton is more center of town, but at the time it was more rural in terms of its surroundings. Again, the comparisons, Robert R. Moton High Auditorium, Farmville High Auditorium. And, just notice for Robert R. Moton High, that auditorium was the center of student life. It was the cafeteria. It was extra classroom space. It was the gymnasium. It had to meet the needs in so many different ways. Whereas the auditorium at Farmville specifically served that purpose. Again, you see the football field for Farmville High and Robert R. Moton High. The Farmville High football field had lights so that night games could be played. Robert R. Moton High, the football field certainly did not have those amenities. And again, it would be that football field where the student strike committee would come together for that first meeting, where Barbara would lay out those goals in her vision and plan. You know, I love this photo. When you look at a community meeting held following the student strike, by this time, the NAACP had become involved with what the students were seeking to do. The students were able to make connection with the NAACP with the assistance of Reverend L. Francis Griffin, and a letter that Barbara Johns and Carrie Stokes would write to that legal team in Richmond, asking lawyers Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, to meet with them in Farmville following the student strike. And while the lawyers for the NAACP initially had no plans in becoming involved with what the students were doing here, you know, you can imagine that as they met with the students, you can imagine that they became impressed with what the students were doing. They became impressed with the commitment that they showed, the resolve that they showed, and as a result, decided to join this effort if the students agreed to fight for desegregation of public schools. Again, initially the fight was just to have that new school building, and if the community would join together and support. And so that was, you know, the purpose of this meeting, to lay out plans as it related to the legal effort to gain that support of the community. You know, as much as I just can only vividly imagine what it must have been like in the Moton auditorium on the day of that strike, you know, it excites me even more to really think about Barbara Rose Johns taking to the pulpit of First Baptist Church in Farmville before this packed audience, and again laying out the reasons in which the students went on strike. Again, making that case to the community about why they felt they needed to move forward with this effort. You know, I think that just speaks to the courageousness that really defines who she was, to be able to do that. I think also in the face of those in the community that might have doubted moving forward with the legal effort, she really stands in that pulpit and defends what these students were seeking to do. I just, you know, get chills thinking about her doing that. Again, you know, Brown v. Board of Education case begins to come together. Again, it's joined with 5 communities. At the time the Davis case was filed, national attorneys Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter were litigating Briggs v. Elliott from Clarendon, South Carolina. There were similar cases in Kansas and Delaware, Washington, D.C., all challenging the constitutionality of segregation in education. The Supreme Court chose to combine and hear all of these cases under the Kansas case, Brown v. Board of Education. This was a strategic decision to have Topeka be that lead case, due to the fact that there was a need to communicate more broadly that segregation was not just a Southern issue. And, you know, with the launch of that Brown v. Board case, we marched towards that 1954 decision that had been handed down. Important to note with Brown v. Board of Education, you know, the 1954 decision was the decision that really answers that constitutional question. But we often know that, you know, with the Supreme Court case, you ought to answer the constitutional question, and then you should lay out the timeline for which that legal effort will be implemented. That second part was not done. And so we see a follow-up court case in 1955, Brown 2, where the Supreme Court would really push that responsibility for that timeline of implementation to the federal courts. And Oliver Hill would famously comment that this meant a whole lot of deliberation and not enough speed, because the Supreme Court declared that we will integrate with all deliberate speed. Following that Brown 1 and 2 decision, Virginia enters this period of massive resistance. And, quite honestly, there's not enough time to give justice to all of the things that happened during this period within the Commonwealth and locally. But we examine this period at the museum by looking at the activities that are happening on a local, state, and national level. Nationally, in 1957, there was a showdown in Arkansas as state officials sought to defy orders to desegregate. President Eisenhower would order units of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to protect those students desegregating Central High School in Arkansas. Virginia wanted at all costs to avoid the media attention and federal intervention that came from that. The Virginia General Assembly had empowered the governor to close any school that sought to desegregate under court orders. This begins a period in the Commonwealth that we know as massive resistance. And with that power, the governor closes schools in Norfolk, Charlottesville, and Warren County. And, we know that later the local county school board would close schools in Prince Edward as they chose not to fund our public school system. Two Virginians gave voice to what was happening locally and nationally during that time. Harry Byrd being the leader of the Democratic Party, that political machine that controlled state politics. He would often articulate that the Brown decision represented a clear abuse of judicial power and pledged commitment to ensure that all lawful means would be used to overturn that decision. Locally, J. Barry Wall, editor of the Farmville Herald, and even a gentleman by the name of James Kilpatrick, who was editor of the Richmond News Leader, were stoking those flames of resistance at the local level in Prince Edward and more broadly across the state. And while massive resistance would culminate in 1958, really all eyes turned to Prince Edward County as that last line of resistance, as the county here makes the decision to close public schools. And at the museum, we tell that story of the public school closings by examining the paths that students would take during this time period. We talk about segregationists organizing to put together a private education for white students through Prince Edward Academy. But we also talk about the Herculean work that continues in the county, even as schools close, as individuals come together to form training centers and programs in the basement of homes, in the basement of churches, to ensure that students had access to some type of normalcy, some type of educational opportunity during this time. But we know that the school closings in Prince Edward really represent a time where individuals did different things based on what they had access to. And we know that there are so many individual stories of the courage and sacrifice that those students undertook during this time. And those are the stories that we seek and strive to recognize. So again, as we talk about what happens here in Prince Edward, it's important to know really that Barbara Rose Johns is a catalyst. And I would like to believe she probably didn't know at the time what would result from the actions that she undertook. But again, it was this recognition that she recognized that her classmates deserved better. And she really worked to foster this idea of collective action as her classmates came together to support this effort. And so at the Moton Museum, we're honored to share this story. We are honored to give context to what this story means from a local, statewide, and national significance. And we are honored to be able to share a bit with you tonight about the story behind the statue that will now reside in the United States Capitol Hall Statuary Collection. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I would love the opportunity to answer questions that you might have.
All right. Let's look. What is in the chat? I don't think we've got any questions in the chat so far, but we do have relatives who are here. Definitely like to give a shout out to Deborah Johns Moyer, who I got a chance to talk with earlier this week. Barbara's dad, Robert, her uncle Vernon Johns, and my grandfather, William Johns Sr. were all first cousins. Met you, Cameron, at the last Johns family reunion. So that's delightful. That's delightful. I'm delighted.
Yes. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Reverend Vernon Johns. And, you know, he was a noted theologian, you know, named one of the country's best preachers, you know, one of, you know, the first African-American to receive that honor, a civil rights leader in his own right, and really an individual that had a profound impact on the entire Prince Edward community. You know, he was known for his intellect. He was known for that vast library collection that he had in his home that he opened up to many of the county's residents, including individuals such as the Reverend L. Francis Griffin, who was a civil rights leader in our community, including Barbara and the entire family. And, you know, he was someone that, you know, provided support, provided encouragement, and, you know, it just, you know, how things connect. You know, Barbara would move to Montgomery following the student walkout. There were concerns for her safety. She would go to live with the Johns family in Montgomery. She would finish her high school career there and matriculate into Spelman College. But, you know, Vernon certainly has a profound impact on the entire county of Prince Edward. And, you know, I just want to mention him and what he means and who he was.
And we have more of Barbara's family here, so delighted to have you with us. We have Linda Johns Atchford, and Dolores Johns, and Lonnie Johns. And Barbara's sister, Joan Cobbs, is on here as well. Maria Davis says her maternal ancestors lived on Israel Hill, and her mom was a 1956 graduate of R.R. Moton. So that's really cool to have people who lived it and knew it who have joined us tonight. So we have a question. Whoops.
Go ahead.
Well, we have the first of our questions. I think we are starting to have a few. Were there any notable white allies in Miss Johns' fight?
You know, there were certainly some notable white allies. One ally in particular was an individual by the name of Dr. C. Gordon Moss, C.G. Gordon Moss. He was the dean of the faculty at Longwood College. And this was particularly during the school closing period when he was very outspoken against public schools closing to the point where it to the point that it impacted him professionally. It impacted his standing within the local Episcopal Church. And so really it's an individual looked at as having stepped out in a profound way. Just truly believed that the decisions the county was making were not the right decisions. And, you know, I think it's a powerful testament that in the last year, Longwood University has named two of its signature buildings, two buildings that were recently renovated in honor of Dr. Moss and Barbara Rose Johns. And these are the two highest structures in our community that can be seen from any point in town. And they bear the names of those two individuals who really labored in a profound way.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. Let's see, then a question from Dennis. Will the museum have a celebration of Barbara Johns Day this year?
So yes, Barbara Rose Johns Day in the Commonwealth of Virginia is April 23rd, 2020. And I'm excited that this year we have a new event that we are deploying. And that event is called Moton Live. So it takes place on the 23rd of April, which is a Friday. And it's also an event that's going to serve as a fundraiser for the museum because of the fact that we will not be holding our banquet this year. But on that April 23rd day, between the hours of 10 a.m. and 8 p.m., we will be facilitating a number of panel-based discussions, various entertainment pieces throughout the day. There's a group in our community, a jazz trio that has written a new song called Strike, a call to action. We're excited that they're going to debut that song. And, you know, over the course of the day, we're hoping that individuals will offer support, which will allow us to continue the work that we do. But we've got big plans. And I've got an announcement that I will share as we close the presentation after the Q&A. Okay. But we look forward to celebrating on April 23rd.
You definitely want to know how to get involved in that.
Definitely.
I apologize, my phone is ringing. I'm sure it's a spam call. Nothing
No
as important as this. From Betty. Betty Wolf asks, proportionally, what percentage of families of color sent their children out of county or out of state for education during the shutout period?
You know, I don't have that number specifically in terms of what that percentage is. You know, I think that is certainly scholarly research that we would love to have access to. You know, as I look at who's on the call tonight, you know, I would love to believe that there might be some friends of Moton, some friends of mine, such as Brian Grogan and others who might have thoughts on that. But, you know, we recently added in the museum a display. It's the newest display to our permanent exhibit that we call our digital wall of names. And it is a part of the exhibit that really allows us to track close to 3,000 names of individuals locked out of school between 1959 and 1964. And these are just the names of those that were school age in 1959. It really doesn't account yet for those names of those that became school age after schools had closed. But, you know, having those names just really brings into context as you scroll just the volume of individuals and families that were impacted during that time. And it's a really neat exhibit experience where you can track a student by name, you can track a student by the school that they were attending right as schools closed in 1959. But I appreciate that question.
What a tremendous impact that must have had on those lives. That's
profound to kind of stand and take that in.
Oh, we have several questions that are what happened to Barbara Johns later in her life? What happens afterwards?
She marries. She spends her professional career as a librarian in the Philadelphia school system. She attends Spelman College and then receives her postgraduate degree from Drexel University. Raises a wonderful family, and unfortunately passes away prior to really watching this story come into the consciousness of so many individuals across the country. And as I talk to her sister and members of her family, I know she would be extremely humbled for all of the recognition that this story has received. And I would like to believe that she would think that as folks come to know who she was, that it really makes her happy that they're coming to learn about this history in full. So they're learning about the student strike. They're learning about what happens following Brown v. Board. They're learning about what happens when public schools close for that 5-year period.
Because it's hard to fathom.
It is. I mean, it's this is a story that really, when you think of it, it has a generational impact, a multi-generational impact on our community that's even felt to this day.
Well, Teresa asks, what books do you recommend for information about Prince Edward County and integration across the county?
So I would start with Bob Smith, as he was known then at the time of writing the book. R.C. Smith. I would start with that book, They Closed Their Schools. We were very fortunate with his blessing to have the opportunity as a museum to republish that book. So I would start with that. That's a foundation. He was really the first individual to kind of capture what had happened. And additionally, there have been some great books that have come about. Brown's Battleground by Jill Titus, Brian Grogan, and Dr. Brian Daughtery recently published a book, A Little Child Shall Lead. And what I love about that book that they published is it really gives a lot of great primary resources that kind of give you a close look at what was happening in Prince Edward during this 13-year period and even after schools had reopened. So there's a lot of good work, and we're very fortunate that work continues to be done to add to the scholarship. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there are a number of books that have been written by individuals that have experienced this history firsthand, whether it be Reverend J. Samuel Williams, who writes about the power of the Black church and how they rally together to support the community during this time. Dorothy Holcomb, who writes about her personal experiences during the school closings. So a lot of great scholarship. And while I would love for you to come to the Moton Museum and visit our bookstore, you can certainly purchase these books via Amazon and other outlets as well.
We hope we'll get to Moton in your bookstore soon.
Yes,
Definitely.
Look forward to it.
From Betty. Betty Wolf asks, in what ways did the strategy of mass resistance influence public school administrators in other nearby districts? How would you assess the allies of people advancing mass resistance?
You know, that's a good question. You know, I think, you know, as you look at the counties surrounding Prince Edward, you know, certainly, you know, individuals might have spoken out in their own ways. You know, Oliver Hill and the legal team, they tried to make some inroads in Cumberland County, you know, and you know, were famously told not to show their heads, not to show their faces there again. You know, I remember a visitor to the museum within the last couple of years who shared with me a letter that her father had received as a school administrator in Buckingham from the governor, reminding them that they were not to move forward with integration following the Brown decision. And so I think, you know, we still continue to learn those pieces related to county involvement, but certainly it kind of varied county to county.
Valerie asks where Barbara Johns was born.
Born in New York, and, you know, spent her formative years growing up in the Darlington Heights community. It was certainly very common during that time period that, you know, parents might relocate based on job opportunities that had become available to them. But, you know, she spent her formative youth years in Darlington Heights.
Is that
and
in
the
New York?
family certainly still has very close ties. No, Darlington Heights is a community in Prince Edward County, Virginia.
I don't know my Prince Edward County geography terribly well. Goodness. Important question from Deborah. How is Moton doing in the face of the pandemic as far as fundraising?
That is a good question. You know, 2020 has definitely presented its challenges. When you administratively, fundraising has certainly been on the decline. I think, you know, a lot of that is based on the fact that, you know, we saw a lot of the corporate foundation support that we traditionally receive. A lot of those corporate entities and foundation entities really retooled their support to meet the needs of the COVID pandemic. But, you know, that certainly creates impact for nonprofit institutions such as Moton. Additionally, you know, we saw a decline with individual donations. And, you know, I think that really just speaks to the fact that, you know, folks have been truly impacted by the pandemic. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as folks move forward. But I tell you what, we were very heartened towards the end of 2020 as a lot of individuals were responding to some of the racial incidents that we had experienced as a nation. And it really prompted them to give us a good push as we closed out the year. So we were very fortunate for that. And while we think a lot of those individuals might be one-time supporters, we're hoping we can keep them engaged as we move forward. But, you know, we're very fortunate that we've got a great program called our Moton Family Challenge, where we've got families impacted by this history, that engage in a friendly fundraising competition on behalf of the museum throughout the year. And so that support is meaningful. And so we are continuing to think creatively about how we move forward. But for all the challenges fundraising wise, and as director, you think most sometimes about those things. It really, I think our staff have felt renewed coming out of 2020 from the standpoint that, I think it really has required us to be creative about the way in which we deliver programs. It has forced us to be creative about the engagement opportunities we provide to the K-12 institutions that we work with. So we are in a good place, holding on.
Well, do keep on holding. We've got some comments from Kim George. Dr. Gordon Moss was my husband Steve's grandfather. We'd love to be in touch.
Excellent. I would love that. Mark your calendar for March the 18th. We will have the C.G. Gordon Moss lecture. That lecture, we bring in a notable historian who has contributed to the scholarship as it relates to issues related to Prince Edward County. And we're excited that we're going to welcome Dr. Dewana Wall, who is the assistant professor of history at Sweetbriar College. And I'm really excited for Dr. Wall's presentation because her scholarship as it relates to Prince Edward really explores the politics post-school reopening in Prince Edward. And I think that is an area of scholarship that we are excited to explore more closely. So March 18th, 7 p.m. And you can get those details at motonmuseum.org.
We've got another question from Gail. How did the Moton teachers respond to the walkout and strike?
It's a good question. I wish I could elevate Miss Johns Cobbs into the conversation. The teachers, they didn't know what was happening until it happened. And I think that's pretty remarkable when you think of today. I don't know if today you could have kept something as secretive as the students kept that student walkout in 1951. But I always hear stories that they had to nudge the teachers to exit the auditorium, because it was rare. I mean, as a young person during that time, you never really, quote unquote, defied adults in that way during that time. But I think the teachers quickly grew to be supportive of what the students were doing. I mean, they recognized the conditions that they had to teach in, that the students had to go to school in. And so, while there was certainly concern about the impacts that teachers might face, I think it really is powerful that the community really came together to embrace what the students were doing. I think Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, in some ways, never really saw Prince Edward as the place, or knew if the community would embrace that effort in the ways that were needed. Fighting a legal effort, it's long, it's hard, and there's a lot of pushback that comes as a result of that, and you've got to be ready to take that on. And Prince Edward proved that they were ready.
Well, I think that's all the questions I see. Then we've got another, at least a dozen comments thanking you for an awesome presentation. The great opportunity to learn, to remember history, remember the impacts that this had in some people's personal lives who were of age at that point. Lots of superlatives, and thanks to you. I'll read this one from Teresa. Thank you so much. I now know why a statue of Barbara Johns is going to be in the United States Capitol building. What a brave young woman she was. Those of you who are relatives have so much to be proud of.
Yeah, you know, I just imagine that moment when the statue is placed and a young person walks by it and they turn and they look up into her face, and they see the face of someone that's young and that looks like them. And I hope that it will inspire them to want to create change in their sphere of influence that Barbara was able to create here in Prince Edward County that impacted the nation. So it's an exciting time. Indeed, an exciting time. I do want to share as we close, we were very fortunate yesterday to have the town of Farmville install a historical marker recognizing Barbara Rose Johns. It was been a partnership with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. We had connected with the Johns family. And, you know, initially we didn't know if this marker might go out to the home in Darlington Heights, but they felt just like we did at the museum, that having it here at the museum at the site of where the action took place would be a great way for folks to be able to engage with it and ensure that it gets that high visitation. So we're very excited about that. And, you know, the neat thing about this historic marker is that it is the result of a historical marker contest that Governor Ralph Northam held last year. And there were a group of 4th grade students from Fairfax County Public Schools that wrote the text for that historic marker and submitted it as part of that competition.
Jumped on late.
And so, you know, it's exciting that the teacher mentioned that these young students
I jumped on late.
were adamant that Barbara Johns was the person that they wanted to honor in this way. Their teacher had shared about who she was, the contributions that she helped to make. And so I think this, again, is another powerful example of students coming to know this history. And we want to definitely continue that work.
Goodness, so remind us one more time of April the 23rd, I think you said, is going to be Barbara Johns Day. What's going on? How can people get involved?
Definitely. April 23rd, Barbara Johns Day across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the day that we will hold our Moton Live event. So if you visit motonmuseum.org/live, you will see information about the event. You will also be able to stream the event from that page on the day of the event. And you will see the schedule that is starting to come together of the panel discussions and the entertainment pieces that we will make available. So we're very excited for that day. And we're hoping that as folks engage, it will hopefully inspire you to share your financial support so that we can continue this important work. Our goal in this effort is to commemorate the past, seize the moment, and pledge to Moton's future.